right.
Now that we have confirmation, what you are sorted as far as that's concerned,
yes,
we are definitely ready to begin. Right, ladies and gentlemen, we profusely apologize for that delay. We are ready to start. We just needed to connect with our lecturer. We were having trouble with connecting with his audio there, but we are definitely good to go. Allow me to thank you very much for taking out an evening on a Saturday to join us on this masterclass. If you have been attending from level 1, I want to take this time out as well and really thank you for your commitment. I also know the struggle of data. It's a very harsh and unkind one. So it means a lot, and it speaks volumes about your commitment and your eagerness to learn as much as you can about Africa and use whatever knowledge you acquire as an agency to change the face of our people. So thank you so much. I hail you for your commitment. We are starting today with level 2, and level 2 will be focusing on the invasion of Africa. It will look into Arab-led slavery, the European slave trade, and today we will also look into the Berlin Conference, where Africa was scrambled, like cake, where different countries, European countries, took a stake of Africa, of course, to control it and to exploit it. So I'm very excited about today. We have two very phenomenal lecturers, and we are starting with Mr. Velimbele. Mr. Velimbele is an Afrocentric essayist, Black Power proponent, a Pan-Africanist. He's also the secretary of the Black Power Front and a co-founder of the online Afrocentric channel Mutapa. So we are very excited, and we thank you, Mr. Mbele, for your commitment as well to come forth and share your wisdom with us. Without further ado, I will hand it over to you. The floor is yours, sir.
Ngiyabonga mfowethu. You are giving me a lot. You are giving me the floor. Yeah, thanks so much mfowethu. First thing nje awuthi ngiqale nje ngibonge the opportunity that has been availed by Arise Black Child, for us to come and share this platform and become part of this masterclass. We appreciate that. And we have decided that our presentation today on the Arab-led slavery of Africans and European-led slavery of Africans will dedicate it to a young black brother who was killed on Wednesday by the police in El Dorado Park, Nathaniel Julius, that we come to this presentation with him and his family in mind, and the many other black people who have been killed by the state, both after and before 1994, and have not sought justice. And since we are ready to start, without much ado, what we are going to do here quite briefly is that we are going to divide our presentation or talk into two segments, and we will start logically with the Arab-led slavery of Africans, and then we will conclude with the European-led slavery of Africans. And now, just by way of trying to set the context for our talk, I just wish to make at least 4 observations, opening observations. The first observation is that Much of what we know about Africa and ourselves does not come from us, but from foreigners, many of whom who have a very low opinion of us. 2, the historical timeline through which we locate our history is not our own. And 3, just as Christianity can't be separated from European invasion of Africa, you can't separate Islam from the Arab invasion of Africa. And 4, there is a huge project of intellectual duplicity amongst some Muslim scholars that is aimed at making sure that there is no critical examination of the Arab-led enslavement of Africans, you know. Now, with that context in mind, the objectives of our lecture today are going to be as follows. That 1, we are going to seek to provide an overarching narrative of the Arab and European-led slave trade of Africans. 2, we are going to outline the characteristics of these imperialist projects. We are going to demonstrate the impact of these imperialist projects. And 4, we are going to suggest how we as Africans should respond to all of this. Now, by way of starting, I thought it was important that even before we go into the detail of the Arab-led slavery of Africans, that we reflect a bit on the scholars, you know, of the Arabs, or the scholars of Islam, you know, who are some of the people that usually give justification or give validity to what they do, either as Arabs or as Muslims. And I thought I should start with the most revered book amongst Arabs, in particular Muslims, the Quran. In Surah 4, the Quran states, and I quote, "And if any of your slaves ask for a deed in writing to enable them to earn their freedom for a certain sum, give them such a deed. If ye know any good in them, ye give them something yourselves out of the means which Allah has given to you." Close quote. That is in Surah 4 of the Quran. Then there is a Muslim scholar called Al-Jahiz Kebab, in his Avarice and Avaricious, who states, and I quote, "We know the Zanj blacks are the least intelligent and the least discerning of mankind, and the least capable of understanding the consequences of their actions." Close quote. Then there's a medieval Arab writer, Al-Muqaddasi, who says, and I quote, "As for the Zanj, they are people of black color, flat nose, kinky hair, and little understanding or intelligence." Close quote. The last one is from another Arab scholar called Al-Dimaski, who says, talking about the people of Sudan and the Zanj coast, he says, and I quote, "The moral characteristics found in their mentality are those of the instinctive characteristics found naturally in animals." Close quote. These are Arab or Muslim scholars, and they are reflecting on what their perceptions are of African people. For over 1,000 years before European invasion of Africa, Africa's invaders came from Western Asia, which is today referred to as the Middle East. During the 7th century, the Arabs invaded North Africa 3 times. They brought with them an alien religion, Islam, language, customs to the native Berber tribes of the Sahara and the Mediterranean hinterland. Marching out of Arabia around 1639, they entered the non-Arab Egypt. 43 years later, they had reached the shores of the Atlantic. In just 70 years, they had subdued the whole of North Africa, instituting a new order. This conquest from the Nile to the Atlantic was more complete than anything achieved by previous invaders, and the changes it brought were permanent. The Arab slave trade was the practice of slavery in the Arab world, mainly in Western Asia, as I stated earlier, North Africa, East Africa, and certain parts of Europe, such as Iberia and Sicily. Iberia, as you know, is the part that is occupied by Portugal and Spain. The trade was focused on the slave markets of the Middle East, North Africa, and the Horn of Africa. The people that were traded by the Arabs were not limited to one race or ethnicity or even religion. It also included, the Arabs also traded in the Turks, the Iranians, the Europeans, the Berbers, especially during the early stages of Arab-led slavery. During the 8th and the 9th centuries of the Fatimid Caliphate, most of the slaves were Europeans, and they called them the Sakaliba, captured along the European coast during the wars when the Arabs were spreading to that part of the world. Towards the 18th and the 19th century, the flow of Zanj slaves of the East Africa increased with the rise of the Oman Sultanate, which was based in Zanzibar. They came into direct conflict, which is the Arabs, with the Portuguese and the other Europeans along what is called the Swahili coast. But eventually they collaborated with the Portuguese and made Zanzibar the biggest slave trading market in the world at the time, you know. So one of the things that's really said is that actually there was collaboration between the Arabs and the Europeans, you know, at some stage of the slave trade. And we'll talk later about what the Europeans did. The North African Barbary states carried on a piracy against European shipping and enslaved European Christians as they were passing through the East African coast. The Arab slave trade of the Zanj in East Africa is one of the oldest slave trades, a point we made earlier, predating the European transatlantic slave trade by 700 years. Male African slaves were often employed as servants, soldiers, or laborers by their owners, while female slaves, including those from Africa, were long traded to the Middle Eastern countries and kingdoms by the Arabs and Oriental traders as concubines and servants, something that continues today. You may know of one of the stories of a lady from Ethiopia called Alem de Chassa, who died as a result of being ill-treated by her slave master. They call them, you know, consultants or recruiters for domestic work, but it's an extension of Arab slavery today. Arab slave traders were involved in the capture and the transportation northwards of the Sahara Desert, the Indian Ocean region, into the Middle East, Persia, and the Far East, you know. So it then means that they had the widest network, you know, of selling slaves, because they did not just sell Africans to the Arabian Peninsula or to the Arab world. They also sold Africans in other parts of the world, like Persia and the Far East. That's why you find there are some Africans who are in other parts of Asia. They sold them even in China, they sold them in India and other parts of the world. It is estimated that between the years 60, 50 and 1900, between 10 and 18 million Africans were enslaved by the Arabs and taken across the Red Sea, the Indian Ocean and the Sahara. Due to the nature of the Arab slave trade, it is impossible to be precise about the actual numbers, which is the actual numbers of Africans that were taken. But one thing that is for sure, all credible studies indicate that when compared to the European slave trade, the Arab slave trade is not just the one that precedes it, but it is the biggest, the most comprehensive, and arguably also the most damaging. So the numbers, when you look at the transatlantic slave trade, you talk something between, say, 12 and 15 million. Some of the research that I've interacted with suggests that when it comes to the Arab slave trade, it runs into something like 50, if not 60 million of Africans that were captured over that period. From the year 60-50 up until the 1960s, the Arab slave trade continued in one form or another. Now, if you look at it, 1650 to 1950, that is from the 7th century to the 20th century, that it still continued. It had not stopped. In 1953, for instance, the sheikhs from Qatar, when attending the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II, had their slaves with them in their retinues. And they did so again when they visited again 5 years later. Also recently in the 1950s, the slave population in Saudi Arabia was estimated at just over 450,000, which is about 20% of the population. It is estimated that the Arabs took as many as 200,000 Sudanese children and women into slavery during the Sudanese Civil War that happened and continues to happen there. You have a unique situation there where, as you know, part of the north of Sudan is controlled by the Arabs, and then the southern part is controlled by the more Christian, especially the Dinka and the Nuer, you know, and when you look at them, they are more of the indigenous people there. Now, as part of the war there, the Sudanese Islamic Party that rules that country has been using as a weapon of war the enslavement of the Sudanese who are in the south, you know, and this is part of the conflict that is raging in that part of the world. Now, in places like Mauritania, even though slavery was formally abolished in Mauritania, right, and even criminalized, it still continues till this day. It is estimated that up to 600,000 or 20% of the population of the people in Mauritania live in slavery. And there is our kin there, our family in Mauritania, the Haratin, you know, who look just like me and you if you are African, are the people that the Arabs are targeting till this day and are trading. And they are kept in the type of slavery where they are in bonded slavery because many of them are poor. So they are then forced into the type of slavery with the Arabs because it's a way of surviving for them. That concludes, just in a nutshell, the part that deals with Arab slavery. You know, let us now go briefly into European-led slavery of Africans. Like we did with the Arab-led slavery of Africans, we will reflect a bit also on the anti-blackness of European scholars, you know, the philosophers that many of us revere and praise, you know, and whose ideas that we follow. But many of them are actually horribly anti-black. So in his Physique Geographie, Volume 2, Immanuel Kant, the philosopher, wrote, "Humanity reaches its greatest perfection in the white race. The Negroes are lower, and the lower are some of the American people," close quote. In his lectures on philosophy of history, George Hegel, which, as you know, is one of the people who was very influential on Karl Marx, George Hegel states, "At this point, we leave Africa not to mention it again, for it is no historical part of the world. It has no movement or development to exhibit. What we properly understand by Africa is that unhistorical, undeveloped spirit still involved in the conditions of mere nature, and which had to be presented here only as on the threshold of world history," close quote. And Karl Marx, writing to his lifelong friend Friedrich Engels in 1862, Karl Marx says in this letter that he writes to his lifelong friend Friedrich Engels, "It is now quite clear to me that, as his cranial structure and head type prove, Lesile is the descendant from the Negroes who joined Moses'